You all got that notification loud and clear? Awesome. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name's Claire. I am currently a high school junior and a member of Mo365 FTC. I've been on the team for 4 years now, and I've been involved mostly in project management and the marketing side. So I have been involved with documentation and judging for all 4 years that I've been on the team. And I learn new things every year, but I'm happy to be able to share some of what I've learned and what I've read from other teams with you all today. And today I am joined by my teammate Victoria, who will also be presenting.
Hi, I'm Victoria. This is my first year in Mo. I'm a freshman in high school and I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah. Awesome. So today's agenda, first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about just why these two items are important at all. We know since you're here, you probably have some idea that they are important, but I'll reiterate on that point. Then I'll be talking about the engineering portfolio a little bit, first going over just the general rules, then some of our team's tips and recommendations, and then some resources your teams can use moving forward. After that, I will pass it off to Victoria, who will talk about the judging presentation side of things. And then we will have some time for Q&A at the end. However, I do want to note that we would love to make today more of an open discussion than just a presentation. And so if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to post them in the chat. And we will also pause every few slides in case anyone is brave enough to say them out loud as well. All right. So first of all, I just want to touch on why are the engineering portfolio and the judging presentation important for us? And this is something that is really important to me because at the end of the year, right, we'll go into the competition and you'll probably bring your robot with you. But as we know, FIRST really is about a lot more than just robots and that final product. And so the portfolio and the presentation are a great chance for you to tell the judges about your team's journey and all of the thought and effort and lessons learned and mistakes that go into your robot. And additionally, it's a great chance for you to spotlight what your team did in your community, whether that was outreach events or social media, or maybe within your school community, things like that, and showing how your team was an advocate for STEM and FIRST in the area around you. And then one other thing, I do want to encourage all of your teams that after you finish up with your final competition this season, please don't throw away your portfolio. Not that you would do that anyway, but it is actually can be a really helpful tool for you to show to your sponsors or your schools, local media, things like that, because it should be a great summary of what your team did this year. And it's hopefully something that you can be really proud of. I know I will definitely be showing it to my parents just to prove that I was doing something all that time on Zoom. And one other thing, the portfolio and the presentation are both required for your team to be eligible for most judged awards. And so, as you might know, in order to progress from a qualifier to the next round of competition, there are 2 ways you can do that, either through the robot game or through a judged award. And so having that extra avenue can help your team gain the opportunity maybe to go to a new place or compete with more teams in another event. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start talking about the engineering portfolio today. And again, feel free to add any questions in the chat as we go along. Okay, so first of all, just going to give a general overview. The engineering portfolio is supposed to be like your team's CV or resume, just a short summary filling up everything that your team did that season. It can be as many as 15 pages plus 1 cover sheet. And it's kind of, you can think of it as a little bit like a summary of an engineering notebook. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, the engineering notebook is optional and has been optional for about 2 years now. But basically what the notebook typically is a very, very long document, sometimes like 300 pages, I know, where teams document much more detail about every meeting, every decision, things like that. And so as I mentioned, the notebook is not required this year and wasn't required last year either. If your team has been creating a notebook throughout the season, then that will definitely come in handy as you go to create content for the portfolio. But again, if your team does not have a notebook, that is completely okay. And you'll also have a not too hard of a time making a portfolio either. Yes. And so as I said, it's 15 pages. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what to include on those pages. Now, helpfully, FTC leaves it pretty free form and open to teams about what is actually required to have in the portfolio. As far as I can tell, the only absolute requirement for the engineering portfolio is to have your team's number on the top middle of the front page. So I think this here is about the most basic definition of what we would consider to be a portfolio. So technically, if you want to walk in and submit that at Delaware State, you'd be okay, I think. But probably we want to include a little bit more than that. We do have 15 pages. So some of the sections that FTC recommends your team includes the engineering summary. And so that might be things like your design process, how each of your mechanisms progressed, your game strategy, things like that. Secondly, a team plan. And this could also be called a sustainability plan, a business plan, a marketing plan, things like that. And so, as you could probably tell from those titles, the team plan could include information like your budget, how your team recruits new students and mentors, goal setting, things like that. And then finally, the third recommended section is team information and outreach. And so this is where FTC recommends that you introduce all of your team members and mentors, and you discuss what outreach your team did, whether that was community service, maybe helping other teams, attending a workshop like this even, things like that. And then just another list of things to include. And so these bullet points are taken directly from Game Manual 1, which is where we get a lot of this information. And so these are some of the things that judges are specifically looking for when they go through your portfolio. And so we wanted to make sure that we highlighted those things that your team can be sure to include them as you develop your portfolio. And so things to include your design evolution or your design process, sketches or CAD, maybe obstacles your team faced, goal setting and how you work towards those goals, plans for each student to learn skills from older members or mentors in order to make your team sustainable. And then finally, this last bullet point is actually my favorite part of the portfolio, which is each team member's concise thoughts throughout the season. And so this can take many forms, but the way that our team like to do it is by having every student fill out a short form about what's your favorite part of the robot or what's a lesson you learned that season, so we can make sure we're getting everyone's contributions into the portfolio and weaving that throughout. Okay, so I'll just pause for a moment now to see if anyone has any questions before I keep talking. Victoria, I know, is keeping an eye on the chat. How are we doing, Victoria?
I don't see anything right now, but you guys can ask questions out loud too if you want.
Okay. All right. Cool. So we'll keep moving on. And as I said, feel free to add questions as, oh, I see something in the chat now. Okay. Victoria.
Is this better? Yeah.
Oh, yes, I do see a question from Daruk. Victoria, do you want to read it?
Yeah, so when presenting the portfolio, do you speak along with it like a presentation or do the judges just read it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Daruk, and thanks for asking. So the portfolio that you submit, you will basically, the way it works is that when you go in for your judging presentation, which Victoria will talk about in a minute, you will have prepared a 5-minute presentation for the judges, and then you will give your portfolio to the judges separately. And so you wouldn't typically speak through your portfolio unless you certainly could. So let me clarify that a little bit. If you would like, you could make your judging presentation kind of a presentation of your portfolio, but most teams prefer to do like a different slideshow or skit. And so typically when you give the portfolio to the judges, they would review it by themselves after you've left the room. And so the judges would mostly be reading it. And so that's a great question because it is important to give the judges all the information they need right on that document, because you won't necessarily be able to explain it to them as they're reviewing it. So thanks, Durek, for that question. Hope that helped. Okay, cool. So I'll go ahead and move on. I know that information was maybe a lot, and there's definitely a lot that FTC judges want to see in the portfolio. And so for teams who are looking to start their portfolio, we wanted to give you a guiding set of questions to go along with. So first of all, your team should think about what software you want to use. I know our team typically likes to use Google Slides because it's easy to do design elements and it's collaborative so that multiple people can be editing at once. However, we also know that lots of teams like to use Google Docs or another text editing software. And so that's a choice that's up to your team. Additionally, you'll want to think about how many pages to allocate to each section. And this should be based on what your team's strengths are and what you want to highlight. For example, if your team did a lot of community service, then you'll probably want to give lots of pages for that. However, if your team was more focused on the mechanical side of things, then giving lots of space to document your design decisions might be a great way to highlight that process to the judges. Working off of that, you'll then want to look at which team members will be responsible for each section. And then finally, we really recommend that your team does a couple rounds of feedback and editing with your portfolio. And so, for example, I know Delaware States is about a month away now. And so that's plenty of time for you to make a first draft of your portfolio and then show it to maybe parents or mentors or even sponsors who would be willing to give you feedback. It's that you can make it better and clearer so that the judges can understand it better and get a better idea of what your team is come the competition day. All right. And so now I'm going to go through some of our team's tips about making the engineering portfolio. And so our first one is to tailor it to specific award criteria. I've included a screenshot on the right here of Game Manual 1. And so you'll be able to see that Game Manual 1 actually helpfully does outline all of the things that judges look for when evaluating your team against each award category. So for example, if your team is really strong in the Think Award, you'll want to make sure that you are hitting all of those bullet points that judges will be able to nominate you for that award. Additionally, we recommend that you do involve a lot of your team members, hopefully all of them, when creating your portfolio. And that can take the form of, as I mentioned earlier, including those quotes from each team member throughout the portfolio, but also something like making sure that the CAD person who designed a specific mechanism is the one who is writing the paragraph about that, because that'll help make sure that your portfolio is a lot more detailed and shows just the complete scope of all the work your team did by getting everyone involved. Now, additionally, if your team does have an engineering notebook that you've made available, FTC does recommend that you reference specific pages in your portfolio so that judges can then quickly reference your notebook if they want to see more detail about a specific mechanism or a specific outreach event. And then finally, my final tip here is to prioritize the content over the style. Now, definitely, if your team has a couple students who really like graphic design, then this can be a wonderful place to have fun and be creative. However, we did talk with some judge advisors last year, and they all said that while making your portfolio well designed and maybe more aesthetically pleasing can be definitely great for the judges, they are more focused on reading the actual content of it. And so a team won't be disadvantaged if it's in a simpler style than another team's. And so to that point, definitely prioritize the content rather than the style, and don't feel pressured to go either way if it doesn't suit your team's strengths. And so going off of that point, I did want to show a couple examples of how different teams have styled their portfolios. And we do have links to all of these in the resources slide coming up so that your team will be able to go through these in more detail. But I wanted to highlight how a couple different teams approached the challenge of the engineering section. And so you can see that there are a variety of approaches, right? Over here, we see great detail in text about different generations of the intake. And then over here, there is more emphasis on the photos. And then over here, I really like how this team laid out all of their CAD iterations. And so that can just show you a bit of the scope of what different teams have done with the engineering portfolio and how different layouts can work just as effectively to convey the same information. And so here we have some of those resources for your teams as you start creating your portfolios. I do want to highlight specifically Game Manual 1, as I mentioned, has those helpful award categories and what judges look for. And also first here, we have this template that our team has designed that can be a great starting point if your team is new to this process. Victoria, are you able to see this Google Doc here?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. And so here in this template, we provided just the basic information taken from Game Manual 1 that should hopefully help provide a helpful outline for your teams about what to include in each section. And as I mentioned, it's not essential to have every single point here. Prioritize your team's strengths and what is most important to your team, but it will help you maybe guide your design decisions for the portfolio and make sure you're hitting on the important points that judges can get a full idea of what your team's like. All right. Victoria, can we see the presentation again?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. So that about wraps up my discussion of the engineering portfolio. I do want to definitely pause and ask if there are any questions about this section before I hand it off to Victoria to talk about the judging presentation.
To answer the question in the chat, yes, the engineering portfolio will be shared.
Yes, Victoria is exactly right there. We will share this link out with all the attendees right after the meeting. All right, any other questions? Okay.
I'll start off with the judging presentation then. So once again, my name is Victoria. I just realized I forgot to say what my role is on the Mo team. So I am the social media manager, and I'm part of the marketing team, or as we like to call it, the Mo marketing team. And let's get started with the judging presentation. So what is it? It is a 5-minute presentation where teams have to present to 2 to 3 judges, and that will be followed by a 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A. And here, only students can present. So just so you know, the Delaware competition this year will be doing judging virtually. However, we know that there are also teams from other regions here, so I would make sure to check the rules that are for your state. And pit interviews. So the judging presentation is separate from pit interviews. So if your team is nominated for an award, judges may return to ask more specific questions. So you need to make sure that you're prepared for that as well. And I see a question in the chat. Is it a good idea to have a lead editor for the portfolio? They can ensure consistency across the different submissions from team members.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you for adding that. If Victoria, if you'd allow me, I can speak on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that having a lead editor can be very helpful, especially someone who can have a good idea of the styling for all things and make sure that the people who are best equipped to write a certain section are the ones responsible for it. So thank you for bringing up that point, definitely.
So I'm going to continue with the judging presentation right now. So for preparation, make sure to prioritize the information you want to talk about. You will definitely not have enough time to cover everything in a 5-minute presentation, and the judges will be asking questions about other topics. Make sure you choose who will present. Some teams have team leaders present while other teams have team members speak, but make sure all students are prepared to answer questions and discuss their contributions, especially if you have a pit interviews person. Also, make sure that you create your presentation. This is a time where teams can get creative. You can do a skit, a slideshow, a verbal presentation, but just make sure you practice everything beforehand so the judges can see that you came into this process prepared to give them a presentation. And also, make sure you reference the game manual. This will help you visualize the entire interview process. Presentation tips. Highlight what makes your team unique. The judges will be seeing a plethora of other teams, and you need to make sure that your team stands out from the others for the nominations. Also, judges this year will be asked to politely cut off teams after 5 minutes, so make sure you hit important points in the given time frame. And make sure to mention things that might not come up in the Q&A session. Judges will probably ask you about your robot, but they may not ask about specific outreach events that you organize unless you mention it in your presentation. If there's anything that you guys are proud of this year that you prepared or anything that was significant, make sure you say that in your presentation so they can ask you follow-up questions. And below we have some content ideas of what you can include in your presentation. You want to definitely make sure that you introduce your team, where you're located, and who are you. And you can also include your team's strengths and weaknesses, goals and accomplishments, and more. I definitely recommend that you guys should include pictures because it allows the judges to visualize what you guys did this year. And yeah. And then Q&A tips. Make sure you practice answering questions ahead of time. Be specific and use examples and stories. The more detailed would be the better. Be ready with specific examples of the time you learned something or a challenge you faced. And you need to make sure that you're ready to show your robot up close, especially in virtual sessions. I would practice positioning your laptop or your camera if you are presenting over Zoom. And also collaborate with your team members. You can have multiple students help answer each question. This shows the judges how your entire team was involved in the preparation process and the entire task is not on one person. And then resources. So we did link the judging manual and the game manual 1. So the judging manual has just some sample questions and some details on the nomination process. And I would look at that just so you guys can have an idea of the questions judges will be asking. And also for game manual 1, we just wanted to highlight an important section, 4.4, and that just goes in depth about the process of going into the judging presentation and everything leading up to that day. Thank you for listening, and that concludes our presentation. If there's any questions, you can type them in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. I will stop the share now and allow definitely time for some questions now.
Oh, so I see a question right now, and it says, are you allowed to play a short video clips over web meeting judging sessions?
That's a great question. As far as I know, I believe that would be allowed by the rules. I think I would recommend if you choose that, definitely confirm with game manual 1 that that is allowed. But I would recommend if you choose that option, probably keep those video clips shorter because judges would want to see your in-person public speaking skills as well. But that could be a good way to demonstrate your robot's capabilities, especially if the judges aren't able to see that live in person. Yeah, exactly. Like demonstrating a specific mechanism, that might be a great option.
So we also had some questions that we prepared that we would like to ask. So can we handwrite our portfolio rather than make it online?
Yeah, thanks, Victoria. And so the question about handwriting the portfolio, absolutely. Your team can choose to do it either online, and that's mostly what we discussed because we know that a lot of teams, especially this season, have struggled to get consistent in-person meeting times. And so for teams like that and teams like ours, an online version was the best option. But absolutely, as Victoria said, if your team prefers to handwrite the portfolio, that is an option. You just want to make sure that you'll have a scanned online file that you can share with judges for your competition, but definitely handwriting the portfolio is an option.
The second question is, how do pit interviews work for virtual judging?
Yeah. So in terms of virtual pit interviews, definitely a little bit unconventional as far as judging goes. But this actually is what happened at Delaware State's last year. And the way that it worked was that after you had your scheduled 15 minutes with judges, there was then a block scheduled later in the day that was about an hour long, where teams were asked to just be available on that online call, kind of like in different breakout rooms. And then judges would pop in a couple times if they had more specific questions for your team. And so that's how that would work in a virtual environment like Delaware will be this year.
And then our last question is, should we still include control award info or programming content in the engineering portfolio?
Yeah, So to give a little bit of background on the Control Award, for those of you familiar, the Control Award is a little bit special as far as FTC awards go, because in order to be considered, your team does have to submit a separate Control Award form that is provided on the FTC website, and we can maybe provide a link to that as well. And so while you will be submitting that extra form specifically for the Control Award, it is also a requirement of the Control Award to have elements of that documented in the portfolio as well. And so, yes, short answer, yes, you should document part of your control, your programming elements, sensors, things like that in the portfolio, as well as that Control Award form if your team wants to be considered. Yeah, and so thank you for running that Q&A, Victoria. Do we have any other questions? Yes, I agree with the comment in the chat here that everyone should have a backup in terms of, I think that's referring to the judging presentation. Definitely, that's a great point, especially if you're online and someone's Wi-Fi cuts out. I know that that always seems to happen at convenient moments. You should definitely practice having multiple team members step in to present a certain section, just in case something like that does happen. And we're happy to just wait a few more minutes if anyone has more questions. But while I'm waiting for that, I will just quickly post my Discord and email in the chat, and Victoria can as well, so that if you have any other questions that pop up later, please don't hesitate to send them our way, and we're happy to discuss our thoughts or maybe point you at more resources if that would be helpful. And we do have a question about the driver hub hardware. I know Arnav is here. Arnav, I'm not sure if you have information about this.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the question. Version 1.2 of the hardware or of the new software is my question to that.
It was an email we got about the driver hub firmware for the 2022 season.
Oh, okay. Yes. So I'm not up to date on whether it is required or optional. But I will say that you should probably update if you're using the driver hub to that new firmware, because there were some bugs that we were experiencing that would have been fixed in the most recent update. Updating is not super difficult. You just have to use the Rev hardware client, I believe, and I can post a link to that. And you can just plug in your driver hub, hit update, and it'll take care of it for you.
Yeah, thanks Arnav for stepping in with that one.
No problem.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much for attending. As I said, please, if any other questions come up, don't hesitate to send them over to our team or post them in the Delaware FTC Discord server if your team is part of that. And thank you so much, everyone. And Victoria and I are happy to stay on for a few more minutes if everyone has more questions. Yes, and there will be a recording of this Zoom sent out to every attendee. So thank you, everyone. Yep, thank you for the nice words, everyone.